I put $7 million into an irrevocable trust for my 3 children. I thought I was securing their future. But 2 weeks later, as the ink dried on the final document, my wife of 50 years looked me dead in the eye, smiled a smile I had never seen before, and whispered that none of them were mine. Then my eldest son looked at me and said 6 words that will echo in my mind until the day I die. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply walked out, made one phone call to my lawyer, and prepared to destroy everything I had built. My name is Warren Gallagher. I am 77 years old. If you are listening to this, pay close attention. Sometimes the people you would take a bullet for are the ones holding the gun. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe betrayal should never go unpunished. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is right now. The mahogany table in my private home office felt colder than usual that Tuesday afternoon. For 40 years, I had run Gallagher Freight and Logistics with an iron fist. I built a massive fleet of 500 trucks from a single rusty rig. I survived market crashes, cutthroat competitors, and grueling 14-hour days. I missed birthdays and anniversaries because I was out on the road. I did it all for Diane, my wife, and for Preston, Monica, and Derek, my 3 children. They were sitting across from me now. Preston, 54 years old, was nervously tapping his gold Rolex. Diane, 73, sat perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly over her designer purse. I held the heavy brass pen staring at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the table. It was an irrevocable trust. $7 million in liquid, untraceable cash handed over to them, completely tax-free. It was the first phase of my retirement plan, a monumental gift to ensure my legacy would protect them forever. I signed my name on the final dotted line. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the quiet room. I slid the thick leather portfolio across the polished table toward Preston. I expected a sincere thank you. I expected a warm hug. I expected the profound warmth of a family united by a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. Instead, Diane reached out and placed her hand firmly over the documents. She did not look at the paper. She looked directly at me. The gentle, loving expression she had worn for 5 decades melted away in an instant. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated triumph. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply mocking. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that cut through the silence of the room like a razor blade. "You really are a gullible old fool, Warren," she said. I froze, the pen slipping from my fingers. I asked her what she meant, assuming it was some kind of twisted, out-of-place joke. My heart began to pound heavily against my ribs. She smiled. A slow, chilling smile. "I have carried this secret for 50 years, she said smoothly. "You worked yourself to the bone. You missed holidays. You ruined your health to build this massive empire for your precious children. But Warren, none of them share a single drop of your blood. Not Preston. Not Monica. Not Derek. You have been funding another man's legacy your entire life." The air vanished from my lungs. My chest tightened violently, a familiar, dangerous pressure gripping my heart. I looked at Preston, my eldest boy, the son I had taught to throw a baseball in the backyard, the son I had bailed out of financial trouble more times than I could possibly count. I waited for him to react, to defend his mother, to shout that she was losing her mind. Preston did not shout. He did not look shocked or confused. He simply picked up the trust documents, straightened his expensive silk tie, and looked down at me with absolute, undisguised contempt. He leaned in close and said the 6 words I will never forget. "Thanks for the cash, old man." They already knew. They all knew. They had been sitting across from me, pretending to be my loving family, waiting patiently for my signature to secure their massive payout. The cruelty of it paralyzed me. I had just handed $7 million to a group of complete strangers who had parasitized my entire existence. My whole life was a carefully constructed, humiliating lie. A lesser man would have flipped the table. A weaker man would have suffered a fatal heart attack right then and there. But I did not build the largest independent freight company in the state of Ohio by losing my temper when backed into a dangerous corner. The initial shock instantly transformed into a terrifying, icy clarity. I did not scream at them. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, buttoning my suit jacket with steady hands. "Where are you going?" Diane asked, her voice suddenly laced with sharp uncertainty. She wanted a massive reaction. She desperately wanted the satisfaction of watching me break down and beg for answers. I did not give her that pleasure. I walked past them without saying a single word. I opened the heavy office door, walked down the long hallway of the mansion my money had paid for, and stepped out into the biting, cold air. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely insert the metal key into the ignition. I pulled out my phone and dialed the private number of Jonathan Pierce, my ruthless corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Jonathan," I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of emotion. They took the bait. They signed the trust papers. Now I need you to prepare the Trojan horse. We are going to burn them to the ground. I hung up the phone, taking a deep, ragged breath. I needed to get away from the estate immediately, but as I reached across the passenger seat to grab my heavy winter coat, my arm brushed against a leather bag sitting on the floorboard. It was Diane's spare purse. She must have left it in my truck after our dinner the previous night. The purse tipped over, spilling its contents entirely onto the rubber floor mat. Lipstick, a thick wallet, a few crumpled shopping receipts. But something else rolled out from the dark depths of the bag. A small, dark glass vial. I picked it up carefully. It was completely unlabeled. There was no prescription sticker, no pharmacy name, no dosage instructions whatsoever. Just a clear liquid inside a dropper bottle. Diane took standard medication for joint pain, but it was always neatly organized in clearly branded pill bottles. She never carried anything like this hidden away. A sickening feeling crawled up my spine. My mind raced rapidly back to the sudden, unexplainable fatigue I had been feeling over the last few months. The random bouts of severe dizziness. The terrifying heart palpitations that my doctor continually dismissed as normal stress for a man my age. I stared at the mysterious vial in my trembling hand. The betrayal of the fake paternity and the stolen $7 million was a catastrophic, soul-crushing blow. But looking at this unlabeled bottle, my decades of survival instinct screamed a much darker, far more sinister truth. My fake family was not just trying to take my money and run. They were quietly, methodically making sure I would not be around to fight back. I held the cold glass vial against the steering wheel, my mind piecing together the horrifying puzzle. 2 weeks ago, I had collapsed in the kitchen, gasping for air, while Diane calmly poured herself a glass of water before calling the paramedics. She had blamed my blood pressure. Now the chilling reality stared me right in the face. Every cup of coffee she had lovingly brewed for me every evening, tea she insisted I drink before bed, had been laced with whatever poison was sloshing inside this tiny bottle. They wanted the trust signed today, and they wanted me dead tomorrow. I squeezed the vial tightly in my fist, feeling a dangerous surge of adrenaline flood my veins. They thought I was an obsolete relic, a stepping stone to their permanent wealth. They thought they held all the winning cards, but they forgot one crucial detail. I built my fortune by outsmarting the most vicious predators in the industry. I started the engine, the roar of the diesel motor filling the silent cabin. The war had begun. I slipped the glass vial into my heavy coat pocket and stepped out of the cold truck. The heavy oak doors of the estate felt different as I pushed them open. I found Diane in the expansive kitchen. She was humming a soft tune, arranging a bouquet of white lilies on the marble island. She looked up, her expression perfectly composed, the mask of a loving wife securely back in place. I walked over and placed the vial directly on the counter next to her flowers. I asked her what it was. She did not flinch or drop the vase. She picked up the small bottle with a gentle, dismissive laugh. She told me it was just a homeopathic tincture for her arthritis, a specialized blend of joint drops her new holistic doctor had recommended. She seamlessly pivoted the conversation, her voice dripping with fake concern. She walked over to the coffee maker and poured a fresh cup of dark roast. She handed it to me, her fingers brushing against mine. She looked into my eyes and said, "The transfer of the $7 million was simply stressing my aging mind." She told me I was working way too hard. She said my paranoia was just a symptom of exhaustion. She urged me to drink the warm coffee, relax in my study, and let the children handle the heavy lifting from now on. I looked at the steaming mug in my hand. My instincts screamed at me to pour it down the sink. But I needed her to believe that her manipulation was still working. I needed her to feel completely in control. I took a slow sip, nodding silently, as if her soothing words had pacified my irrational fears. The rich coffee tasted perfectly normal to my tongue today. I turned my back to her and walked down the long corridor toward my study, carrying the mug. I sat behind my desk, my mind racing through strategies and legal maneuvers. But 30 minutes later, the strategy sessions in my head ground to a violent halt. It started with a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Then a massive, erratic thud echoed in my chest. My heart began to palpitate wildly, slamming against my ribs like a trapped animal. The edges of my vision rapidly darkened, blurring the important financial documents spread entirely across my solid mahogany desk. I tried to stand up, gripping the edge of the table, but my legs had turned to lead. The air in the room felt impossibly thin. I gasped for breath, knocking a stack of files to the floor. The last thing I remember before the darkness entirely consumed me was the sound of Diane's footsteps slowly approaching the open doorway of my study. She did not rush to help me. She did not scream for an ambulance. She simply stood there in the doorway, watching me fall with cold detachment. I woke up to a rhythmic, synthetic beeping monitor sound. The smell of clinical antiseptic burned my nostrils. The ceiling was composed of bright, sterile white tiles. It was a private hospital room, secluded and silent. I tried to move my arms, but a thick wave of lethargy pinned me to the mattress. Through my sluggish, half-open eyes, I saw them. Preston and Diane were standing at the foot of my bed, speaking in hushed, serious tones, with a tall man in a crisp white medical coat. I had funded the cardiology wing at the local city hospital, and I knew every senior physician on the medical board personally. I had never seen this man in my entire life. I let out a dry, raspy cough, shifting my weight against the stiff hospital sheets. The three of them immediately turned toward me. Diane rushed to my side, grabbing my hand with a theatrical display of profound relief. She stroked my forehead, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She told me how terrified they had been when they found me unresponsive on the floor of my study. The doctor approached the side of the bed, holding a metal clipboard. He looked at me with an expression of deep clinical pity. He introduced himself as a visiting neurological specialist. He spoke slowly, using a patronizing tone, typically reserved for young children. He told me I had suffered a severe transient ischemic attack, commonly known as a mini-stroke. He pointed to a series of brain scans attached to his clipboard, tracing his pen over dark shadowed areas of the printouts. But the stroke was not his primary concern. He looked at Preston, then back at me, delivering the fatal lie with practiced precision. He said the tests revealed advanced rapid-onset dementia. He claimed the extreme stress of my corporate lifestyle. He said this specific lifestyle had triggered an irreversible cognitive decline. He said my brain was actively deteriorating, causing severe paranoia, memory gaps, and a complete inability to manage my own affairs. Preston stood behind the doctor, his face arranged into a mask of dutiful, solemn grief. But I could see the subtle, triumphant twitch at the corner of his mouth. This was their endgame. The $7 million was just the appetizer. The dementia diagnosis was the legal weapon they needed to strip me of my remaining $60 million freight empire. They were building an impenetrable medical fortress. They needed to prove I was entirely incompetent immediately. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trapping the intense fury boiling inside my chest. I nodded weakly, playing the part of a broken, confused old man facing the terrifying end of his mental faculties. The doctor patted my shoulder, adjusted my heavy blankets, and told me to rest. He asked Preston and Diane to step out into the hallway to discuss the immediate steps for my long-term medical conservatorship. Diane squeezed my hand one last time, promising she would be right back. The heavy wooden door clicked shut firmly. They left me alone in the sterile silence of the room. A few seconds later, the door creaked open again. A young nurse stepped inside. She was holding a plastic tray of fresh intravenous bags, but her hands were shaking violently. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, making sure the hallway was completely clear before pushing the door securely shut. She hurried over to the side of my bed, completely ignoring the medical equipment. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. She leaned down, bringing her face inches from my ear. Her voice was trembling badly. It was a desperate, terrified whisper. She told me I did not have a stroke. She said they were deliberately altering my blood charts and suppressing the toxicology reports. She told me the doctor was hired privately by my son to falsify my medical history. She slipped a small, folded piece of paper under my pillow. She whispered that the dosage of whatever they gave me was lethal, and if I stayed in this room another night, I would never wake up. The absolute truth crashed over me like a tidal wave. They were going to kill me by morning. The young nurse slipped out of the room, the heavy door clicking quietly shut behind her. I lay perfectly still in the sterile hospital bed, staring at the ceiling as the chilling reality settled into my bones. They were going to kill me by morning. The slow, methodical poisoning, the fake doctor, the forced dementia diagnosis. It was a flawless execution designed by the people I had loved most. But they made a fatal error. They left me alone. I waited exactly 10 minutes to ensure the hallway was completely clear. My heart was pounding not from the poison this time, but from a cold, calculated fury. I threw off the heavy white blankets and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. A wave of dizziness washed over me, a lingering effect of whatever toxic cocktail they had pumped into my veins. I gripped the cold metal railing of the bed, forcing my breathing to steady. I reached for the intravenous line taped to the back of my hand. I ripped the needle out in one swift motion, pressing my thumb hard against the puncture wound to stop the bleeding. I scanned the dim room. My personal belongings had been stuffed into a clear plastic hospital bag resting on a vinyl chair in the corner. I moved quietly across the linoleum floor and tore the bag open. My trousers, my boots, and my heavy winter coat were all there. I dressed myself quickly, my hands moving with urgent precision. I reached into the deep pockets of my coat to check for my wallet and phone. My fingers brushed against the smooth glass of the unlabeled vial I had taken from Diane earlier today. Next to it was a small black plastic travel comb. Preston had left it on the passenger seat of my truck 2 days ago, and I had absent-mindedly shoved it into my pocket to return to him. I stared at the dark strands of hair caught in the fine teeth of the comb. A sudden, desperate idea took root in my mind. I cracked the hospital room door open. The corridor was empty, bathed in the harsh fluorescent glow of the night shift. I slipped out, keeping my head down, and moved quickly toward the red exit sign, illuminating the service elevator at the far end of the hall. I stepped inside the metal box and pressed the button for the basement loading dock. The elevator descended with a low mechanical hum, carrying me away from their medical death trap. I slipped out through the delivery bay doors into the freezing Ohio night air. The biting wind hit my face, clearing the last remnants of the narcotic fog from my brain. I pulled out my phone and ordered a private car service, directing the driver to pick me up at the rear intersection, away from the main hospital cameras. The black sedan arrived 3 minutes later. I climbed into the back seat, giving the driver an address for an independent 24-hour private medical laboratory located on the outskirts of the city. I had used their premium corporate services for years to conduct executive health screenings for my freight company. I knew the director, and more importantly, I knew they valued absolute discretion. The city lights blurred past the window as we drove through the desolate streets. My mind was a whirlwind of terrifying revelations. Diane had lied about the paternity of my 3 children. Preston had openly mocked me after stealing $7 million. And now they were actively attempting to murder me to seize the remaining $60 million of my corporate empire. I looked down at my hands. They were weathered and scarred from decades of building a fortune for a family that did not actually exist. The car pulled up to a sleek, modern glass building. I walked through the sliding double doors into the brightly lit reception area. I bypassed the standard waiting room and walked directly to the premium services desk. The night manager recognized me instantly. I placed my heavy black titanium credit card on the counter. I told him I needed a comprehensive, expedited blood toxicology screening immediately. I also pulled the black travel comb from my coat pocket and placed it carefully into a plastic specimen bag provided by the desk clerk. I demanded an expedited genetic comparison test utilizing the hair follicles from the comb against my own blood sample. I told him money was absolutely no object, and I needed the results processed directly in their on-site laboratory within the next 2 hours. The manager nodded swiftly, ushering me into a private examination room. A phlebotomist arrived moments later, drawing several vials of my blood. Once the samples were secured, they left me alone in the quiet, comfortable lounge to wait. The silence of the room felt deafening. I poured myself a glass of cold water, trying to wash away the lingering metallic taste of the hospital drugs. I sat down on a leather sofa, pulling my smartphone from my jacket. I needed more answers. I needed to know exactly how deep this conspiracy ran. Diane was a cunning, deceptive woman, but she was entirely careless with her digital security. For 15 years, I had paid the cellular bills and managed the family data plans. I knew her cloud storage credentials by heart. I logged into her email account, navigating past the security prompts with practiced ease. My eyes scanned through the bright screen, sifting through mundane receipts and social club newsletters. Then I found it. A hidden folder simply labeled with the initials of my eldest son. I opened the folder. The very first email was a long thread between Diane Preston and an external legal counsel I did not recognize. I tapped on the most recent message sent just 4 hours ago, while I was lying unconscious in the hospital bed. The subject line read, "Emergency ex parte conservatorship." I read the legal text attached to the email, my blood turning to absolute ice. They were not just stealing the initial trust fund. They had drafted a formal petition to the state of Ohio, scheduled to be filed at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The petition utilized the falsified dementia diagnosis from their hired doctor to declare me completely legally incompetent. The court order would instantly grant Preston total control over my physical person, my medical decisions, and every single asset belonging to Gallagher Freight and Logistics. They were locking the cage before I even knew I was trapped inside. A soft knock on the door pulled me from the glowing screen. The night manager stepped into the room holding 2 thick, sealed manila envelopes. His face was uncharacteristically grim. He handed the first envelope to me. It was the toxicology report. I tore it open and read the highlighted chemical analysis. My blood contained dangerous elevated levels of digoxin. It was a potent cardiac medication used to treat severe heart failure. Administered to a healthy heart, it causes violent palpitations, severe weakness, and eventually a fatal cardiac arrest. Diane had been poisoning me for weeks, building the illusion of a failing body to match their fake dementia diagnosis. I set the paper down and opened the second envelope. The genetic comparison test. I pulled out the single sheet of paper, my eyes instantly locking onto the bold black letters printed at the bottom of the page. The probability of paternity was 0%. Preston was not my son. The final, undeniable proof of my entire wasted life stared back at me. I folded the papers neatly and slid them into my coat pocket. My mourning period was officially over, It was time to burn their world to ashes. The dashboard clock read exactly 4 in the morning when we pulled into the gravel lot of a secluded diner on the industrial side of town. The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming a relentless rhythm against the metal roof. I told my driver to keep the engine running. I pushed open the glass door. The bell chimed, a lonely sound echoing across the empty room. The air smelled of stale coffee and grease. I walked past the empty booths and slid into the darkest corner table. A man was already sitting there nursing a black coffee. His name was Vincent. He was a retired federal investigator who spent 2 decades hunting organized crime syndicates before moving to the private sector. I had retained his services several times to vet high-level corporate executives for my logistics firm. Tonight I was here to investigate the people living inside my own home. I slid the sealed envelope containing the toxicology report and the genetic test across the sticky table. Vincent picked it up, opened the flap, and read the documents in complete silence. His face remained perfectly carved in stone. He showed no surprise. When he finished, he placed the papers face down and looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. I asked him the one question tearing my mind apart. I needed to know why my children were so violently desperate for my money. I built Gallagher Freight and Logistics from absolutely nothing. 40 years ago, I bought one single rusted rig. I slept in the cab for 3 straight years, showering at truck stops and eating canned soup to buy my second truck. I poured my blood and sweat into the asphalt of this state to build a fleet of 500 commercial vehicles. I provided Preston, Monica, and Derek with premium trust funds, Ivy League educations, and highly lucrative executive positions. I gave them every financial advantage a father could bestow. They were completely set for life. They each earned massive salaries that would take a normal man decades to accumulate. I demanded that Vincent explain how 3 adults handed the keys to a $60 million kingdom could be so utterly broke they would resort to murdering the man who fed them. Vincent took a slow sip of his coffee. He reached into the heavy leather briefcase resting by his boots and pulled out a thick stack of printed financial dossiers. He spread them across the table, illuminating the catastrophic reality of their hidden lives. He told me my children were not just broke. They were drowning in a sea of toxic, insurmountable debt. He started with Derek, my youngest son. Derek had secretly filed for total bankruptcy 3 months ago. He gambled away his entire corporate salary on highly leveraged tech startups that completely imploded. He leveraged his massive suburban estate to the absolute maximum, and the banks were scheduled to foreclose on his property by the end of the month. Then Vincent pointed to the second file. Monica was in even worse shape. Her husband had been quietly indicted by a federal grand jury for embezzling millions from his commercial real estate firm. They desperately needed massive amounts of cash to pay off ruthless defense attorneys and attempt a quiet settlement before federal prosecutors threw him into a maximum security prison for 20 years. But it was the third file that truly froze the blood in my veins. Vincent slid the final, thickest dossier toward me. It belonged to Preston, the son who openly mocked me after stealing my $7 million trust. Vincent explained that Preston had bypassed the standard stock market entirely. 2 years ago, he took his enormous corporate bonuses and funneled them directly into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange based out of a shadowy Caribbean island. He thought he was a financial genius, untouchable and smarter than the rest of the market. But the exchange was nothing more than a sophisticated front operation backed directly by a ruthless international cartel. When the market crashed, Preston did not just lose his own savings. He had taken out massive illegal bridge loans from the cartel's shadow bankers to cover his margin calls, fully expecting the market to rebound. It never did. Preston currently owed them $15 million. Vincent looked me dead in the eye and stated a terrifying fact. The people Preston owed money to did not send collection letters. They sent armed enforcers. They had given my eldest son a strict, non-negotiable deadline to pay back the $15 million. That deadline was the exact reason they needed me declared legally incompetent by tomorrow morning. The $7 million trust was just a small down payment to keep the cartel from hunting him down. They needed total control of my $60 million company to liquidate my assets and pay off the remaining balance before the cartel made good on their violent threats. They were sacrificing my life to save their own. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled heavily on my shoulders. I was surrounded by cowards and thieves, perfectly willing to let me die to cover up their catastrophic failures. I stared at the financial ruin spread across the diner table, shaking my head in disgust. I asked Vincent how Diane could stand by and actively orchestrate the murder of her husband of 50 years just to clean up the messes of her greedy children. Vincent did not answer immediately. He reached back into his leather briefcase one final time. He pulled out a single faded photograph and slid it across the table. It was an old surveillance photo date stamped over 30 years ago. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the grainy image. It showed Diane sitting in a fancy restaurant, laughing brightly. Sitting across from her, holding her hand intimately across the table, was a man I recognized instantly. His name was Richard Belmont. I was a ruthless competitor who had spent the better part of the 1980s trying to destroy my logistics firm. Richard was an unethical man who eventually bankrupted his own company through extreme greed and died miserably in a dilapidated trailer park. Vincent pointed at the photograph with a steady finger. He told me that Diane had maintained a deeply secret, passionate affair with Richard for over a decade. He explained that Richard Belmont was the biological father of Preston, Monica, and Derek. Diane had been quietly laughing at me for 50 years, watching me work to the bone to feed, clothe, and elevate the children of my most hated rival. The absolute truth crashed down on me with terrifying clarity. I had spent half a century building a massive empire for a family that hated me. I carefully folded the photograph and placed it into my coat pocket next to the vial of poison. A dark, hollow void opened up inside my chest, instantly swallowing any remaining traces of the merciful father I used to be. The pain vanished, entirely replaced by a cold, calculating desire for absolute destruction. I looked at Vincent and told him to prepare for war. I left Vincent and walked into the downpour. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs completely. It helped. The drive back was a blur of flashing lights. My mind was no longer clouded by the devastating heartbreak of a ruined family. That weakness was gone, replaced by the tactical discipline that built my logistics empire. I had the driver drop me off a block away from the hospital's rear delivery bay. I slipped past the security cameras and navigated the basement corridors. I rode the service elevator up to the cardiology wing, timing my movement to avoid the nursing staff. The heavy wooden door to my room was exactly as I had left it. I stepped inside the sterile white room and quickly stripped off my damp winter coat. I shoved my heavy boots and clothing back into the clear plastic hospital bag, hiding it carefully beneath the vinyl guest chair in the far corner. I climbed back under the stiff, scratchy blankets, arranged the unattached intravenous tube to look as though it had simply fallen out while I slept, and closed my eyes. I lay there in the quiet darkness, listening to the steady, synthetic hum of the medical monitors. I spent the next 2 hours completely still, preparing myself for the greatest performance of my entire life. The morning sun filtered through the window blinds when the door handle clicked. I kept my breathing shallow, my eyes half closed, maintaining the perfect illusion of a frail, heavily medicated patient. Diane walked in first, her high heels clicking softly against the polished linoleum floor. She held coffee, looking impeccably dressed. Preston followed, accompanied by the same compromised specialist from yesterday. They gathered around the foot of my bed, completely unaware that I knew every single detail of their murderous $15 million conspiracy. I let out a groan, knocking a cup off the table. It clattered loudly to the floor, spilling ice across the tiles. I widened my eyes, staring at them with manufactured terror. I asked Diane where I was, my voice intentionally slurred and trembling with fake panic. I begged her to tell me why I was not at the freight yard for my morning dispatch meetings. Diane rushed to my side, her face twisting into a mask of deep, agonizing sorrow. She stroked my hair, speaking to me as if I were a frightened toddler lost in a supermarket. She told me I was in the hospital, that I had suffered another terrible episode of confusion during the long night. The fake doctor stepped forward, clicking his silver pen. He shined a small bright light into my pupils, muttering sympathetic falsehoods about my rapidly deteriorating cognitive state. He turned to Preston and declared that my dementia was accelerating much faster than he had initially anticipated. I leaned heavily into the dramatic performance. I grabbed Preston by the sleeve of his expensive tailored suit. I looked up at the man who was not my biological son, the man who was trying to feed me to a ruthless international cartel, and I cried. I pushed real wet tears into my eyes, begging him to help me, telling him my mind felt like it was breaking apart into tiny pieces. Preston placed his warm hand over my cold one, his eyes gleaming with a sick, barely concealed excitement. He told me not to worry about a single thing. He said he was going to take care of the entire family and protect my legacy. Preston reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a stack of legal documents. He laid them across the hospital tray table and pushed it directly over my lap. He pulled a pen from his pocket and placed it into my trembling hand. I looked down at the documents. The header read, Property Management and Operational Transfer Agreement. It was exactly what Vincent and I had anticipated during our meeting at the diner. Preston was moving to legally bind the daily operations and total physical assets of Gallagher Freight and Logistics directly into the $7 million irrevocable trust they had forced me to sign 2 days ago. He was building the legal bridge required to liquidate my shipping company and pay off his massive offshore cartel debts. Preston leaned over the bed, his voice dripping with manipulative sweetness and false concern. He told me the company was incredibly vulnerable while I was stuck resting in this hospital room. He claimed the board of directors was getting restless and that our corporate competitors were circling our contracts like vultures. He said signing this operational agreement would temporarily transfer total executive control to him and Diane, protecting my lifelong legacy from greedy corporate scavengers. He promised he would manage the fleet perfectly until I recovered my memory and came back home. It was a brilliant, flawless lie delivered without a single flinch. I looked at Diane, who was wiping a fake tear from her powdered cheek, urging me to completely trust our wonderful, capable boy. I stared at the dotted line printed at the bottom of the lengthy document. I made my hand shake violently, causing the heavy gold pen to rattle audibly against the thick paper. I asked Preston if he was absolutely sure this was the right thing to do for the employees. I stammered, telling him I could not remember how to run the complex shipping routes across the Midwest anymore. He smiled a genuine, terrifying smile of absolute victory. He gently guided my shaking hand toward the paper, whispering that everything was going to be completely fine once I signed. I pressed the sharp nib of the fountain pen against the thick, white paper. I crafted a weak, jagged, distorted version of my usual signature, making it look exactly like the desperate writing of a broken man whose brain was slowly rotting away. I signed all 5 pages of the operational transfer agreement, dragging the pen slowly to maximize the pathetic illusion. Preston snatched the valuable documents from the plastic tray table. The absolute second my pen lifted from the final signature line, he slid the papers eagerly back into his dark leather briefcase, snapping the heavy brass locks shut with a sharp echoing click that filled the room. The hired doctor stepped forward and announced that I needed immediate rest to prepare for my upcoming guardianship hearing tomorrow morning. They filed out of the hospital room one by one, leaving me alone in the sterile, suffocating quiet. I watched. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut and their footsteps faded down the hallway, my violently trembling hands went perfectly, terrifyingly still. I sat up straight against the pillows, a cold, predatory smile spreading slowly across my face. I reached under the hospital mattress, pulled my hidden burner phone from my winter coat pocket, and quickly dialed Jonathan's private number. I listened to the line ring twice, my heart beating with pure, cold anticipation. When Jonathan finally answered, I did not hesitate. We were going to destroy them all right now. They took the bait, I said, my voice completely steady. Prepare the Trojan horse now. Jonathan arrived at the hospital exactly 40 minutes after I made the call. He bypassed the front reception desk, flashing his senior bar association credentials to the floor nurses. He walked into my private room carrying a thick leather briefcase, his face a mask of absolute professional composure. He locked the heavy wooden door behind him and immediately pulled a small electronic sweeping device from his coat pocket. He walked silently around the perimeter of the room, scanning for listening bugs or hidden cameras Diane might have planted. When the small device flashed a solid green light, Jonathan finally relaxed his shoulders and took a seat at the foot of my bed. I sat up, dropping the illusion of the frail, dementia-ridden old man. We did not have time for pleasantries. I told him Preston had taken the bait and secured my falsified signature on the operational transfer agreement. Jonathan nodded slowly, unbuckling the brass clasps of his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of highly classified legal documents. We are dealing with a uniquely ruthless breed of predators, I told him, keeping my voice low. They are actively poisoning me, Jonathan. They have forged my medical records, and they plan to seize my entire $60 million company by tomorrow morning to pay off a massive cartel debt. I need you to confirm that our counterstrike is entirely ready for execution. Jonathan adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled a single blue folder from the bottom of his briefcase. He slid it across the tray table toward me. He told me the trap was fully constructed and primed for detonation. To understand the sheer magnitude of the devastation we were about to unleash on my fake family, you have to understand the absolute brutality of modern United States environmental law. Specifically, a federal statute known as the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. 5 years ago, I made a highly speculative business acquisition. I used an anonymous, untraceable shell corporation to purchase an abandoned, bankrupt chemical manufacturing plant located on the industrial outskirts of Cleveland. The facility was officially registered on paper as Apex Industries. I bought the sprawling, rusted property for pennies on the dollar, intending to eventually raze the old structures and convert the massive plot of land into a centralized Midwestern distribution hub for my freight trucks. However, my environmental engineers conducted a routine soil sample shortly after the purchase was finalized. The results they brought back were an absolute nightmare. The previous owners of Apex Industries had been illegally dumping highly toxic chemical waste directly into the groundwater for decades. The land was catastrophically contaminated. I immediately halted all development plans and buried the shell corporation deep inside my vast corporate portfolio, intending to handle the massive cleanup quietly over the next decade. But 3 months ago, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency audited the surrounding municipal water supply. The EPA officially designated the Apex Industries property as a top priority federal Superfund site. Jonathan tapped his finger against the blue folder resting on my lap. He explained the catastrophic legal reality of a Superfund designation. Under federal law, the government does not care who originally dumped the toxic chemicals. They do not care about the operational history of the bankrupt company. The law strictly dictates that whoever holds the current legal title to the property is held personally, jointly, and severally liable for the entire cost of the environmental remediation. The EPA had officially estimated the total cost to clean up the Apex Industries site at $45 million. It was a massive, inescapable federal debt that could bankrupt almost any organization. I looked at Jonathan, a cold, ruthless satisfaction settling deep into my bones. I asked him if he had successfully managed to bundle the toxic shell corporation into the asset portfolio. He nodded, a sharp, predatory smile playing on his lips. He explained that when I originally signed the $7 million irrevocable trust 2 weeks ago, the documents included a standard boilerplate provision, allowing me to transfer additional subsidiary holdings into the trust portfolio before the final execution date. Utilizing that specific legal loophole, Jonathan had quietly transferred the sole legal ownership of Apex Industries directly into the newly minted trust. Preston and Diane thought they were stealing a pristine $7 million cash fund. They believed they were acquiring the keys to my highly profitable shipping empire. They had absolutely no idea that I had secretly tethered a $45 million radioactive anchor directly around their greedy necks. Once they fully assumed control of the trust, the corporate veil shielding my identity would be completely pierced. The federal government would instantly recognize Preston, Diane, Monica, and Derek as the new sole legal owners of a catastrophic toxic wasteland. The Environmental Protection Agency would descend upon them with the full, merciless weight of the United States Treasury. They would seize their homes, freeze their bank accounts, and completely destroy their lives to recover the cleanup costs. It was the perfect, inescapable trap. But Jonathan raised his hand, halting my moment of silent victory. His face grew incredibly serious. He leaned forward and explained the one massive, terrifying catch to our entire plan. The liability transfer was not automatic just because I placed the toxic company into the trust portfolio. Federal law requires a strict chain of custody for hazardous properties. For the $45 million debt to legally bind itself to my fake family, the designated trustees must formally and actively accept the physical assets of the trust. They had to sign a final comprehensive asset acceptance ledger acknowledging their new ownership. I asked him how we could possibly force them to sign a document containing a bankrupt chemical plant without them noticing. They were greedy, but they had expensive lawyers who might review the fine print. Jonathan shook his head, explaining the psychological brilliance of our strategy. He told me they would absolutely sign it without reading a single word, provided they were completely blinded by the intoxicating rush of total victory. They needed to feel so overwhelmingly powerful and victorious that they would eagerly sign whatever paperwork was placed in front of them just to finalize their conquest. To achieve that specific level of blind arrogance, Jonathan told me I had to do something that went against every single instinct in my body. The emergency ex parte conservatorship hearing was scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning at the county probate court. Preston and Diane were going to stand before a judge, present their falsified medical records, and publicly declare me a victim of severe advanced dementia. They were going to demand the court strip me of my human rights, my physical freedom, and my life savings. Jonathan looked me dead in the eye and delivered the terrifying mandate. He told me I simply could not fight back in that crowded courtroom. If I wanted to spring the trap and financially execute the exact people trying to murder me, I had to completely let them win. I had to deliberately lose the guardianship hearing tomorrow morning. Let them sign their own federal death warrants. The oak doors of the Hamilton County Probate Court swung wide open at 8 o'clock the next morning. I was pushed into the courtroom in a wheelchair, wearing a thin sweater and gripping a blanket over my knees. I stared at the polished mahogany benches and the seal of Ohio mounted on the wall. The room smelled of floor wax and stale perfume. Diane was already seated at the petitioner table. She wore a modest black dress, her hair pulled back to emphasize the deep, weary lines she had carefully painted onto her face with makeup. Preston sat right beside her, flanked by 3 highly expensive corporate litigators. Jonathan stood quietly by my side at the defense table. He did not look at me. He simply organized a thin, deliberately pathetic stack of folders. The judge, an older, stern-looking man named Harrison Caldwell, entered the room and struck his wooden gavel. The hearing for my emergency medical conservatorship had officially begun. Diane was called to the stand first. Her performance was absolutely flawless. She gripped the edge of the witness box, her shoulders shaking, as she forced a stream of perfect crystalline tears down her cheeks. She told the judge a heartbreaking fabricated story about my rapid cognitive decline over the past 6 months. She claimed I wandered at night forgetting names, dangerously mismanaging my freight empire. She painted a tragic picture of a brilliant man whose brain was simply rotting away, leaving his helpless family entirely terrified for his safety. I sat in my wheelchair, letting my head loll slightly to the side, staring blankly at the floor. Every instinct in my body screamed to stand up, overturn the defense table, and expose her decades of infidelity and murder attempts. But I kept my mouth shut. I let her spin her deadly web. Preston was called next. He walked to the stand with the confident, arrogant stride of a man who believed he had already won. He presented the judge with the forged medical records. He handed over a thick binder filled with falsified brain scans, altered blood charts, and fraudulent psychological evaluations. The hired specialist from the hospital took the stand immediately after him. The doctor looked the judge in the eye and testified that I was suffering from irreversible dementia. He stated I was entirely incapable of making basic health decisions, let alone managing a corporate fleet. He strongly recommended granting Preston and Diane immediate control over my physical person and my financial assets to prevent ruin. The judge adjusted his reading glasses, leafing through the fraudulent medical binder. He looked down at me from his elevated bench with profound pity. He asked Jonathan if the defense had any medical experts to counter the diagnosis. This was the critical moment. This was the precise point where my lawyer could have easily destroyed their entire case with the independent toxicology report in his briefcase. Jonathan stood up slowly. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked at the judge with a defeated, apologetic expression. He stated that we had no counter-evidence to present at this time. A collective sigh of relief washed over the petitioner table. Preston leaned back in his chair, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. He thought my lawyer was simply overwhelmed by their flawless preparation. He had absolutely no idea that Jonathan was deliberately surrendering the castle to lock them inside the dungeon. The judge nodded solemnly. He declared that based on the overwhelming medical evidence and the testimonies provided, I was legally incapacitated. He struck his gavel, officially stripping me of my fundamental human rights. He granted Preston and Diane full ex parte conservatorship over my medical and financial decisions. Furthermore, the judge ordered the immediate activation of the irrevocable trust I signed 2 days ago, transferring total operational control of Gallagher Freight into the trust portfolio. I was officially a ghost in my own life. I owned nothing. I controlled nothing. My fake family had successfully stolen my entire life's work right in front of a sitting judge. The judge instructed the court clerk to bring the final trust activation documents to the petitioner table. He informed Preston and Diane that as the designated trustees, they were legally required to sign the asset acceptance ledger in open court. This document was the formal acknowledgement that they were taking full ownership and total legal responsibility for every single physical asset bundled inside the trust portfolio. The clerk placed a massive 400-page legal binder on the table between Preston and Diane. Buried deep inside that mountainous stack of legal jargon, specifically on page 287, was the formal transfer deed for Apex Industries, the toxic chemical plant, the radioactive $45 million federal debt. Jonathan watched them like a hawk. If either of them decided to actually read the appendix, if their lawyers demanded a recess to review the comprehensive asset list, our entire trap would instantly evaporate. I held my breath, staring at the floor, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. But greed is a blinding, intoxicating poison. Preston did not look at the appendix. He did not consult his expensive litigators. He was so desperate to secure the funds to pay off his cartel debts that he could not sign his name fast enough. He grabbed the pen from the clerk and scrawled his signature across the bottom of the acceptance ledger. He passed the heavy binder to his mother. Diane did not even glance at the table of contents. She was too busy smiling at me, relishing her ultimate victory. She signed her name right next to his, with a graceful, sweeping motion. The court clerk stamped the documents with the official seal of the state of Ohio. It was done. The legal chain of custody was completely unbroken. Preston and Diane were now the sole legal owners of a federal Superfund site. They had just unknowingly assumed $45 million in inescapable federal cleanup liabilities. They had signed their own financial death warrants in front of a sitting judge, rendering the agreement absolutely unbreakable. The judge struck his wooden gavel one final time, closing the emergency session. The courtroom began to clear out. Jonathan packed his briefcase quietly and stepped away to speak with the clerk. I remained seated in my wheelchair, staring straight ahead. Preston walked over to me. He stood aggressively close. He leaned down, placing his hands firmly on the armrests of my wheelchair, trapping me in place. His smug, arrogant grin was entirely repulsive. He lowered his face until it was merely inches from mine. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You are going to a state-run facility today, old man," he said, his eyes glowing with malice. "You will rot in a miserable bed until you forget your own name." I did not flinch. I dropped the fragile, confused act entirely. I tilted my head up, looking him dead in the eye with cold, calculated clarity. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face as I leaned forward and whispered back, "Enjoy the real estate, son." The court order was executed with ruthless efficiency. Within 2 hours of the heavy wooden gavel dropping, I was strapped tightly into the back of a state-mandated medical transport van. Preston sat in the front passenger seat, looking out the rain-slicked window, ignoring the fact that he was actively discarding the man who had raised him from birth, the man who had provided him with a life of absolute luxury and privilege. I was entirely focused on the massive corporate wealth he falsely believed he had just inherited from me. The van pulled up to Oak Haven. It was a bleak, decaying brick building on the far eastern edge of the county, entirely funded by the state and desperately understaffed. It was a forgotten dumping ground for the unwanted elderly, a place where people were sent strictly to be ignored until their inevitable passing. This was the exact miserable facility Diane had meticulously selected for me months ago, deliberately choosing a location known for its dismal living conditions and strict isolation policies. The heavy sliding doors opened, and the smell hit me instantly. It was a suffocating industrial mixture of cheap bleach-boiled vegetables and quiet human despair. 2 large orderlies lifted my wheelchair and pushed me down a dimly lit corridor with flickering fluorescent tubes casting long, sickly shadows against the walls. They wheeled me into a cramped gray room containing a single stiff mattress and a rusted metal nightstand. Preston walked in right behind them. He did not look at the peeling paint or the cracked linoleum floor. He simply stepped up to my wheelchair and began stripping away the very last remnants of my identity. He reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my leather wallet, pocketing my identification cards and my platinum bank cards. He unclipped my heavy ring of office keys from my belt. Finally, he reached into my trousers and confiscated my smartphone, turning it off with a sharp click. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor, letting my hands tremble, maintaining the flawless facade of a broken, confused old man who did not understand what was happening to him. Preston patted my shoulder with a sickening, condescending heaviness. He told me I was safe now, that this place would take wonderful care of my deteriorating mind while he secured the family legacy. He turned around and walked out of the room. The heavy security door slammed shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a loud metallic clank. I waited in the cold silence of the room. I listened to the muffled footsteps of the orderlies fading down the distant hallway. I counted to 300, ensuring I was completely isolated. The moment I reached 0, the violent trembling in my hands stopped entirely. My posture straightened. I pushed myself out of the wheelchair and stood firmly on the cracked linoleum floor. I walked over to the small barred window and pulled the thin curtains shut. I turned my attention to the metal air conditioning vent bolted near the ceiling in the far corner of the room. 2 days before the guardianship hearing, Vincent had utilized his extensive federal contacts to secure a complete set of blueprints for Oak Haven. Posing as a municipal HVAC contractor assigned to conduct routine duct maintenance, he had spent 3 hours inside this exact room. I grabbed the edge of the metal nightstand and dragged it silently across the floor until it was positioned directly beneath the vent. I climbed onto the table, reaching up to the aluminum grate. Vincent had deliberately loosened the screws. I popped the grate off, easily sliding my hand into the dark, dusty ventilation shaft. My fingers brushed against a heavy rectangular package wrapped tightly in thick black canvas. I pulled it out and stepped down from the table, setting the package onto my stiff mattress. I unwrapped the canvas carefully. Inside rested a sleek, high-performance laptop, an untraceable burner smartphone, a portable encrypted Wi-Fi router, and a charging cable patched directly into the internal electrical wiring of the building. Preston thought he had effectively buried me alive in a state-run tomb. He thought he had severed my entire connection to the outside world, leaving me utterly defenseless against his hostile corporate takeover. He had absolutely no idea that he had just locked me inside a secure, heavily fortified command center. Ensuring that no one could possibly trace my digital footprint back to this isolated geographical location, I double-checked the encrypted firewall settings. I powered on the laptop. The screen illuminated the dim room with a stark, bright glow. I booted up the encrypted router and established a secure connection to Vincent's private server. 3 days ago, while Preston was busy finalizing the fake medical records, Vincent had bypassed the security systems at Gallagher Freight and Logistics. He had planted a microscopic voice-activated audio bug directly underneath the polished mahogany desk in Preston's new executive office. I opened the surveillance software on the laptop and clicked the live audio feed. A faint rush of static filled my headphones, followed immediately by the clear, sharp sound of Preston pacing frantically back and forth across the hardwood floor. He was not alone in the office. I could hear another man trying to speak, his voice calm, but incredibly tense. I recognized the second voice instantly. It was Arthur Penhaligon, the senior wealth manager at my primary financial institution. Preston was breathing heavily, his voice escalating into a panicked, furious shout. He demanded to know why the wire transfer for the $7 million trust fund was being blocked by the bank. He screamed that he possessed the signed court orders, that he was the legal trustee, and that he needed the liquid cash released into his personal offshore accounts immediately to pay off his urgent obligations. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face as I listened to the bank manager deliver the fatal blow. Arthur cleared his throat nervously and explained the strict parameters of the financial transfer. He told Preston that the $7 million I had placed into the irrevocable trust was not sitting in a standard cash checking account. When I originally structured the trust portfolio, I had legally locked every single penny of that money into non-transferable high-yield federal treasury bonds. The bank manager stated the terms clearly. The bonds carried a strict 120-day maturation lock. Preston could not touch a single dime of that cash for 4 entire months without triggering a massive federal tax audit and voiding the entire trust completely. The audio feed exploded with the sound of Preston violently sweeping everything off his executive desk. Glass shattered against the wall. Heavy books slammed against the floorboards. He screamed in pure, unadulterated terror. I could hear him gasping for air, the terrifying realization setting in. He did not have 120 days to pay back the $15 million cartel debt. He barely had 48 hours before the armed enforcers showed up at his front door. He was completely out of time. I sat in the dim light of the nursing home room, the laptop screen casting a pale glow across the cracked linoleum floor. Through the encrypted audio feed, I listened to the frantic, heavy breathing of my eldest son. His mind was consumed by panic. He was pacing the length of his executive office, muttering desperate curses. Suddenly, the heavy oak door clicked open. The pacing stopped instantly. I leaned closer to the speaker, increasing the volume. A new voice filled the audio feed. It was a man speaking with a terrifyingly calm, polished corporate tone. He introduced himself as a financial consultant, representing the offshore investment exchange. He did not yell. He did not break professional character. That made him infinitely more dangerous than a common thug. The enforcer politely asked Preston to sit down. I heard the leather chair squeak as Preston obeyed, his breathing shallow and rapid. The enforcer reminded Preston of the outstanding $15 million margin call. He stated that his employers had been incredibly patient, but their grace period had officially expired. Preston stammered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. He tried to explain that his father's trust fund was locked in treasury bonds. He begged for just 4 more months to liquidate the assets. The enforcer let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. He placed a heavy, metallic object onto the polished mahogany desk. The dull thud echoed through my headphones. He told me that his employers did not operate on federal banking schedules. They operated on consequence. The enforcer calmly explained that if the $15 million was not wired into their offshore accounts within exactly 48 hours, they would stop asking for money. Instead, they would visit Preston's home in the affluent suburbs. They would introduce themselves to his wife and his 2 young daughters. The enforcer stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He wished Preston a highly productive afternoon and walked out the door, clicking softly shut behind him. The silence in the office was deafening for a full minute. Then Preston completely unraveled. He let out a primal, agonizing scream of pure frustration, violently sweeping the remaining files off his desk. He was a dead man, walking completely out of options, and he knew it with absolute certainty. I listened as he scrambled across the floor, frantically gathering the scattered documents he had just stolen from my hospital room. I heard the sharp rustle of thick parchment paper as he desperately flipped through the irrevocable trust portfolio. He was searching for anything he could immediately leverage. He instantly bypassed all the locked treasury bonds. He ignored the long-term corporate freight contracts because they required board approval. Then suddenly, the frantic rustling completely stopped. I heard him let out a breathless gasp of profound relief. He had found it. I had found the legal deed to Apex Industries hidden near the very back. To a desperate, financially illiterate man looking for a quick lifeline, the paperwork for Apex Industries looked like an absolute goldmine. It was a massive, sprawling industrial manufacturing complex located on 50 acres of prime commercial real estate. The original acquisition documents did not mention the toxic chemical waste or the devastating federal environmental mandates. They simply outlined a massive physical asset, now fully controlled by the trust. Preston immediately picked up his office phone. He dialed a private commercial lending broker he had used in the past to secure high-risk short-term capital. His voice was manic, vibrating with a toxic mixture of adrenaline and blind hope. He told the broker he needed a $15 million emergency bridge loan approved and funded within 24 hours. The broker balked at the timeline, demanding collateral of equal or greater value. Preston eagerly offered up Apex Industries. He boasted about the massive industrial footprint, confidently claiming it was a newly acquired crown jewel in our vast corporate logistics portfolio. The broker remained highly skeptical. He explained that securing a commercial bridge loan of that magnitude against a dormant industrial property required extensive federal underwriting to bypass the lengthy environmental and municipal inspection periods. The borrower had to legally certify that they were the primary operator actively managing and developing the property. The broker warned Preston that signing the federal expedited underwriting forms meant assuming total, unconditional legal responsibility for the physical condition of the site. Preston did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Blinded by the terrifying image of cartel enforcers visiting his family, he eagerly agreed to every single condition. He demanded the broker send the digital paperwork immediately. I sat in the cold nursing home room, staring at the glowing laptop screen. My heart hammered against my ribs with dark, triumphant anticipation. Preston was walking completely blindfolded into the deadliest legal minefield in the United States. 5 minutes later, the sharp chime of an incoming email echoed through the audio feed. Preston opened the document. I could hear him muttering the legal stipulations aloud as he quickly scrolled through the digital forms. The broker remained on the phone, guiding him through the critical liability waivers. He asked Preston to explicitly confirm that he, acting as the primary trustee, was currently managing the day-to-day operations of Apex Industries. Preston confidently said yes. He claimed he was actively overseeing a massive renovation project on the site to convert it into a primary freight distribution hub. It was a spectacular, catastrophic lie. I listened to the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Preston was digitally signing the federal loan applications, checking every single box that legally bound him to the toxic wasteland. He was officially verifying his active management of a federal Superfund site. By submitting those specific underwriting forms to a registered commercial bank, he was generating an undeniable permanent paper trail of liability. He thanked the broker profusely, promising a massive commission once the $15 million hit his account tomorrow afternoon. He hung up the phone, letting out a long, shaky breath of sheer relief. He actually believed he had just saved his own life. He truly believed he had outsmarted the cartel, the bank, and his clueless father, all in one single afternoon. I was completely wrong. He had just handed me the final nail for his coffin. I reached for the burner smartphone, resting on the metal nightstand. I opened the encrypted messaging application, connected directly to Jonathan. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard with absolute precision. I typed out the final execution order. He claimed active management. Alert the feds. I hit the send button, watching the small green checkmark confirm the delivery of the message. Jonathan was sitting in his downtown law office, waiting specifically for this exact signal. He already possessed the digital copies of Preston's newly signed, heavily falsified loan documents, intercepted perfectly through Vincent's network infiltration. Without a second of hesitation, Jonathan packaged the fraudulent commercial loan applications, the forged active management declarations, and the irrevocable trust ownership deeds into a single anonymous digital dossier. He forwarded the entire catastrophic package directly to the regional enforcement director of the Environmental Protection Agency. The deadly trap was permanently sprung. I lowered the burner smartphone, watching the bright screen go completely dark. The digital transmission was officially complete. The federal machinery of the United States government was a notoriously slow, lumbering beast, but once it was given a clear target and undeniable proof of massive environmental fraud, it moved with terrifying, inescapable velocity. I carefully hid the laptop and the phone back inside the dusty ventilation shaft, tightening the metal screws with a small plastic spoon I had quietly taken from my dinner tray the previous evening. I climbed down from the metal nightstand and slid it smoothly back against the sterile wall. I lay down on the stiff, uncomfortable mattress and closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I slept with the profound, uninterrupted peace of a man who knew his enemies were about to be utterly annihilated. The morning sun crept slowly through the barred window of my room at Oak Haven. I woke up, dressed myself slowly, and shuffled out into the bleak, fluorescent-lit hallway. I maintained my physical facade, flawlessly dragging my feet slightly as I made my way toward the communal recreation room, located at the far end of the corridor. The room was profoundly depressing, filled with worn vinyl chairs and tables covered in outdated, torn magazines. A few other forgotten residents sat quietly in the corners, staring blankly at the beige, cinder-block walls. I walked over to the small beverage station and poured myself a cup of the terrible, lukewarm coffee provided by the state facility. It tasted like burnt cardboard and deep regret. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the bitter, highly acidic flavor. Today, it tasted like absolute victory. I shuffled over to a comfortable armchair positioned directly in front of the large, flat-screen television mounted high on the wall. The local morning news program was playing at a low volume. The polished anchors were discussing mundane traffic reports and upcoming weekend weather patterns. I sat back, resting my hands on my lap, and waited patiently. I knew Jonathan had provided the federal agents with everything they needed to secure immediate high-level emergency warrants. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, the standard weather broadcast abruptly cut away. A sharp, urgent red graphic flashed across the television screen, declaring breaking news. The camera cut to a live high-altitude helicopter shot, hovering directly over the sprawling modern corporate headquarters of Gallagher Freight and Logistics. The massive glass and steel building I had constructed with 40 years of blood and sweat was currently completely surrounded by dozens of heavily armored black federal sport utility vehicles. The flashing red and blue lights of local police cruisers blocked every single exit to the massive commercial complex. I leaned forward, my eyes locked intensely onto the glowing screen. The camera zoomed in closer to the main corporate entrance. Teams of federal agents wearing dark tactical body armor were actively swarming the polished marble lobby. Right beside them were specialized investigative units from the Environmental Protection Agency, dressed in bright yellow hazardous materials jackets. They were carrying heavy plastic evidence bins and digital hard drives, aggressively seizing decades of proprietary corporate records. The news anchor's voice broke through the television speakers, vibrating with urgent, shocked energy. She reported that a massive coordinated federal raid was currently underway at the largest independent logistics firm in the state of Ohio. She stated that the raid was the direct result of a catastrophic environmental fraud investigation, strictly tied to a highly toxic abandoned chemical manufacturing facility notoriously known as Apex Industries. The television feed shifted to a ground-level perspective, capturing the heavy glass doors of the main corporate lobby, swinging violently open. Two heavily armed federal agents marched out onto the cold concrete plaza. Between them, stumbling and looking completely disoriented, was Preston. He was not wearing his usual arrogant, victorious smirk. His expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit was thoroughly rumpled and dirtied. His hands were securely locked behind his back in heavy, restrictive steel handcuffs. His face was pale, twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, as the aggressive flashes of surrounding news cameras captured his profound public humiliation. He looked exactly like a cornered, desperate animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. The news anchor continued her rapid report, delivering the precise, fatal legal details Jonathan had meticulously engineered. She announced that the federal government was executing a massive enforcement action under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. She explained to the viewing public that the corporate veil shielding the owners of Apex Industries had been completely and legally pierced. She read the official statement from the Department of Justice confirming that the toxic property had recently been transferred into an irrevocable trust. Because Preston had actively signed expedited commercial loan applications claiming direct daily management of the highly hazardous site, the federal government had legally identified the designated trustees as the sole unprotected owners of a dangerous federal Superfund site. The anchor read the names aloud on live nationally syndicated television: Preston, Diane, Monica, and Derek. She stated that the four specific individuals were now held personally, jointly, and severally liable for a mandatory $45 million environmental cleanup fee. They were also facing immediate criminal charges for attempting to leverage a federally condemned hazardous waste site to secure fraudulent commercial banking loans. They were officially ruined. The camera cut back to the polished news studio where a specialized financial correspondent began breaking down the immediate devastating consequences of the federal mandate. He explained to the audience that a $45 million liability owed directly to the United States government was not a standard debt that could be delayed, negotiated, or discharged through typical bankruptcy courts. He reported that the United States Treasury Department had already authorized sweeping emergency asset freezes across all accounts legally associated with the named trustees. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my terrible coffee. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing, inescapable force. Diane, who had spent 50 entire years sleeping in my bed, while secretly laughing behind my back, had woken up this morning in her luxurious multi-million-dollar suburban mansion. She had likely poured herself a cup of premium French roast coffee, entirely confident that her golden future was perfectly secured by my fake dementia diagnosis. She had absolutely no idea that in this precise fleeting moment, every single bank account, investment portfolio, offshore holding, and credit line bearing her name had been instantly and permanently frozen by the unforgiving power of the federal government. Her credit cards would decline at the grocery store. Her digital transfers would instantly bounce. She could not buy a gallon of gas or a loaf of bread. The luxury she had sold her soul to maintain was completely gone. She was completely, utterly destitute in a matter of seconds, stripped of every stolen resource she possessed. She had treated my entire existence as a convenient, disposable bank account. Now the absolute reality of her extreme poverty would slowly suffocate her. I sat in the communal recreation room, watching the local news cycle repeat the dramatic footage of my eldest son being shoved aggressively into the back of a federal vehicle. The destruction of their fake empire was absolute, but the fallout was just beginning. I retreated to the desolate quiet of my assigned room and locked the heavy door securely behind me. I climbed onto the metal nightstand, retrieved my encrypted laptop from the dusty ventilation shaft, and logged into the secure server. Vincent had been incredibly busy all morning. He had tapped directly into the cellular networks of my other two children, Monica and Derek. I clicked on the first intercepted audio file. The pure, unadulterated panic echoing through my headphones was intoxicating. Monica was shrieking hysterically at her husband over the phone. Federal agents had arrived at her gated suburban estate less than an hour after Preston was paraded on live television. They did not come with questions. They came with official federal liens. Because the environmental mandate held all four trustees jointly and severally liable for the $45 million cleanup of Apex Industries. The United States Treasury was rapidly seizing every single asset tied to their names to satisfy the massive debt. Monica watched in absolute horror as government officials placed heavy padlocks on her luxury vehicles and taped formal seizure notices to the massive oak doors of her home. Derek was experiencing the exact same nightmare across town. His secret bankruptcy was completely blown open by the federal audit. The government had officially seized his personal yacht and frozen his remaining hidden offshore accounts. I listened to a frantic, disorganized conference call between the two of them. There was no family loyalty. There was no shared grief. They turned on each other with the vicious, bloodthirsty aggression of starving wolves. Monica screamed that Preston had completely destroyed her life by signing the commercial bridge loan without consulting them first. Derek threatened to hire a team of vicious defense attorneys to sue Monica and Preston for criminal negligence, completely ignoring the fact that none of them had a single dime left to pay for legal representation. They cursed each other, throwing decades of hidden resentment and bitter jealousy into the open. The bond of their shared stolen paternity shattered into a million irreparable pieces the exact second the stolen money stopped flowing. They were watching their privileged lives evaporate in real time, while the greedy siblings viciously tore each other apart over their shattered inheritance. My loving wife of 50 years was attempting to stage a desperate, cowardly retreat. Vincent sent a secure message to my burner phone detailing Diane's frantic movements. When she finally realized that all her platinum credit cards were declining and her massive investment portfolios were completely frozen by the federal government, she did not stay to comfort her terrified children. She reverted to pure, selfish survival instinct. Diane frantically emptied her personal wall-safe stuffing, a designer duffel bag entirely full of untraceable diamond necklaces, heavy gold bracelets, and vintage luxury watches. She quickly called a private car service, promising to pay the driver in physical cash, and fled directly to the international terminal at the city airport. She intended to board a first-class flight to Switzerland and disappear forever, leaving her children to face the government alone. She underestimated the absolute reach of the Internal Revenue Service. As she approached the premium security checkpoint, dragging her heavy bag of stolen jewelry, she was immediately flanked by 4 stern federal agents. Vincent had anonymously flagged her passport the moment the environmental agency issued the $45 million mandate. The agents stepped into her path presenting their golden badges. They informed her that, as a primary debtor in a massive federal environmental fraud investigation, she was considered an extreme flight risk. I watched a short, grainy video clip Vincent had procured from the airport security feeds. Diane argued, her face turning a deep, angry shade of red. She tried to leverage her social status, demanding to speak to their superiors. The agents were entirely unmoved. They confiscated her passport on the spot. They seized her designer bag, logging the millions of dollars in hidden jewelry as officially seized federal assets to be applied against the massive toxic cleanup debt. She was left standing in the middle of the crowded airport terminal, with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. The untouchable matriarch of the family had been publicly stripped of her wealth, her dignity, and her freedom. But the day was not quite over. The federal magistrate had processed Preston late in the afternoon, because his formal indictment for bank fraud and environmental negligence was still pending. A grand jury review. He was granted a temporary exorbitant bail. The cartel, desperate to keep him on the streets long enough to recover their $15 million, had utilized a shadow bondsman to post his release. Preston was back on the outside, but he was a dead man walking. The federal government was dismantling his life from the top, and the cartel was hunting him from the bottom. He had absolutely zero leverage left, except in his frantic, terrified mind for one single desperate loophole. He needed the man he thought was suffering from advanced dementia. He needed me. The digital clock on my laptop screen glowed brightly in the dark room. It was exactly 2 in the morning. The quiet corridors of the nursing home were completely silent, save for the occasional squeak of a nurse's rubber shoes against the linoleum floor. I sat on the edge of my stiff mattress, staring at the locked metal door. I knew he was coming. Vincent had intercepted a desperate text message Preston sent to an overnight charge nurse he had previously bribed to monitor my condition. Preston had promised her $10,000 in phantom cash to leave the rear security doors unlocked and blind the security cameras in my specific hallway. He believed that if he could just get into my room, if he could physically force me to sign a legal revocation of the irrevocable trust, he could somehow undo the catastrophic damage and shift the $45 million federal debt back onto my shoulders. He thought he could bully a helpless, broken old man in the middle of the night. I heard the faint metallic click of the heavy security door unlocking at the far end of the dim hall. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed ominously on the cold tile, moving steadily toward my room. The dark shadow of a tall man appeared silently beneath the narrow crack of my door. I slid the laptop back under the metal bed and waited patiently in the pitch-black shadows. My aged hands did not shake at all. My tired heart did not race. I took a final deep, steady breath. The final confrontation was finally here, and I was absolutely ready to finish this miserable charade once and for all. I had spent 50 years building a fortune for thieves, and tonight I would make sure they paid for every single stolen dime. The heavy metal door creaked open, the rusted hinges groaning loudly in the suffocating silence of the nursing home. The dim yellow light from the hallway spilled across the cracked linoleum floor, casting a distorted shadow against the beige cinder block wall. Preston stepped into my room. He quickly pushed the door shut behind him, plunging us back into the darkness. The deadbolt slid into place with a sharp click. I remained seated on the edge of the stiff mattress, my head bowed slightly, maintaining the absolute illusion of a helpless, medicated old man. I heard his heavy breathing. It was ragged, shallow, and completely erratic. He was a man drowning in a profound terror, searching for floating driftwood. I was that driftwood. He closed the distance between us in 3 rapid strides. The mask was completely gone, ripped away by the sheer magnitude of the $45 million federal debt currently crushing his life. He lunged forward, his hands grasping the collar of my thin cotton sweater. He hauled me upward with violent, unhinged aggression, pulling my face mere inches from his own. The stench of stale sweat and bitter panic radiated from his expensive tailored suit. He slammed me roughly back against the hard cinder block wall. My shoulders absorbed the heavy impact, but I let my head loll forward, playing the part of a confused, terrified victim. He shook me violently, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper cutting through the dark room. He ordered me to snap out of my pathetic dementia right this second. He pulled a crumpled legal document from his inside breast pocket. He shoved the paper directly into my chest, pinning it against my collarbone. He told me it was a formal revocation of the irrevocable trust. He screamed that I needed to sign it immediately, backdate the signature to last week, and legally claim that I was entirely sound of mind when I drafted the cancellation. He promised me he would get me out of this miserable facility by morning if I signed the paper. He threatened that if I did not sign it, he would walk away and let me rot in this bleach-scented prison until my final breath. I let him scream. I let him pour every single ounce of his pathetic terror into the room. I waited until his chest was heaving, until his grip on my sweater loosened, just a fraction from pure physical exhaustion. Then I stopped pretending. The violent trembling in my hands vanished completely. The hazy fog in my eyes cleared, replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless clarity. I reached up and clamped my heavily calloused hands directly over his wrists. My grip was like a steel vise forged by decades of manual labor in the freight yards. Preston froze, his eyes widening in pure shock as he felt the undeniable, terrifying strength of a man who was fully in control of his mental faculties. I shoved his hands away with a sudden, violent burst of physical power. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own expensive shoes, and crashed heavily against the rusted metal nightstand. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing in complete stuttering disbelief. I stood up from the stiff mattress smoothly. I straightened my thin cotton sweater, brushing the imaginary dirt from my shoulders. I looked down at the man who had stolen my life savings, the man who had conspired with his mother to slowly murder me with cardiac poison. My voice was perfectly steady, echoing through the small room with a chilling, authoritative resonance. I told him I did not have dementia. I told him my mind was sharper tonight than it had been in 50 years. Preston scrambled to his feet, his back pressed tightly against the wall. He stammered, asking how this was possible, asking what was happening. I did not answer his pathetic questions. I reached into the deep pocket of my trousers and pulled out the encrypted burner smartphone Vincent had hidden in the ventilation shaft. I tapped the brightly glowing screen, navigating to the secure audio files we had intercepted from his corporate office. I turned the volume up to the absolute maximum setting. I pressed play. The crisp, clear audio of his own voice filled the dark nursing home room. It was the recording from 2 weeks ago. He was speaking with Diane in the private hospital corridor, plotting the exact dosage of the heart medication required to mimic a fatal cardiac arrest. He was laughing about how easily they had bribed the visiting neurologist to falsify my brain scans. He was bragging about liquidating my $60 million logistics empire to pay off his offshore cartel debts. The digital recording captured every single murderous, treacherous detail with flawless, undeniable clarity. Preston collapsed onto his knees, covering his ears with his hands. He begged me to turn it off. He sobbed a broken sound that bounced off the cinder block walls. He told me he was so sorry that the cartel had forced him into a corner, that he never actually wanted to hurt me. He pleaded with me as his father, invoking the decades of love and protection I had freely given him. He begged me to help him fix the federal environmental mandate, promising he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. I looked down at him with absolute unyielding disgust. I told him he had no right to invoke my protection. I pulled the independent genetic laboratory results from my back pocket and dropped the folded paper directly onto the floor in front of his knees. I told him Diane had been sleeping with Richard Vance for a decade. I told him his entire existence in my house was built on a 50-year foundation of lies. He was not my son. He was the biological offspring of a bankrupt, miserable thief, and he had inherited every single ounce of his real father's cowardly nature. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The last tiny shred of hope evaporated. He stared at the genetic test, his body trembling violently. He realized he had no leverage left. He realized the $45 million debt, the frozen bank accounts, and the cartel enforcers were his inescapable reality. He looked up at me, his eyes dark with sudden vicious malice. If he could not force me to sign the paperwork, he was going to silence me permanently to protect his own skin. He lunged at my legs, reaching for my throat with desperate, murderous intent. But before his hands could brush against my clothes, the closet door swung wide open. A bright, tactical flashlight mounted on a federal-issue firearm illuminated the dark room, blinding Preston instantly. Vincent stepped calmly out of the cramped closet. Right beside him was a tall, heavily armored senior agent representing the FBI. The agent racked the slide of his heavy weapon with a loud metallic clank. Preston was immediately arrested for elder abuse, attempted murder, and bank fraud. The heavy metallic clank of the federal agent's weapon echoed in the cramped nursing home room. Preston did not try to run. The sheer reality of the FBI badge illuminated by the tactical flashlight shattered whatever delusional courage he had left. He dropped to his knees, raising his trembling hands. The agent stepped forward violently, spinning Preston around and slamming him onto the stiff hospital mattress. The cold steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. Vincent handed me a clean-pressed suit jacket. I slipped it on, smoothing out the lapels. Preston was dragged out of the room, crying and screaming for his mother, his pathetic pleas echoing down the bleak hallway. I did not look back at him. My brief, miserable stay in the state-run purgatory was officially over. 3 days later, I walked through the towering mahogany doors of the federal district courthouse. I wore a charcoal bespoke suit, walking with the steady, commanding posture of a man who had completely reclaimed his empire. The emergency hearing had been convened at the highest judicial level due to the extreme severity of the federal bank fraud and attempted murder charges. Preston was sitting at the defense table wearing a bright orange county lockup uniform, his hands shackled to his waist chain. Diane sat 3 rows behind him in the gallery. She looked absolutely hollowed out. Without access to her frozen bank accounts, her designer makeup and expensive hair treatments had faded, revealing the terrified old woman hiding underneath. Jonathan stood at this petitioner podium, methodically unpacking his thick leather briefcase. The very first witness he called to the stand was the compromised neurological specialist who had falsely diagnosed my dementia in the hospital. The doctor looked incredibly pale, sweating profusely under the bright courtroom lights. Jonathan did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He approached the witness stand and slammed the independent toxicology report directly onto the wooden ledge. He demanded the doctor explain the lethal escalating levels of digoxin found in my bloodstream. The doctor stammered, attempting to claim it was a standard prescription error. Jonathan smiled a cold, surgical smile. He pulled a thick financial ledger from his briefcase and projected it onto the massive courtroom monitor. It was a comprehensive list of offshore wire transfers. Jonathan methodically traced a payment of $250,000 originating from Preston's frozen cartel accounts directly into a hidden shell company legally owned by the doctor. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Jonathan pressed harder, his voice booming with righteous authority. He played the audio recording Vincent intercepted from Preston's office, the exact conversation where my fake son bragged about bribing the medical staff. The doctor physically broke down on the witness stand. He buried his face in his hands and loudly confessed to everything. He admitted Preston paid him to falsify my brain scans and slowly poison me to guarantee a fatal cardiac event within the month. The presiding federal judge, an imposing woman with absolutely no tolerance for white-collar corruption, looked at Preston with unyielding disgust. She struck her heavy wooden gavel, demanding absolute silence. She declared that the medical conservatorship forced upon me was an egregious criminal violation of human rights. Without a single moment of hesitation, she officially revoked the guardianship order entirely. She legally reinstated my complete autonomy, granting me total, uninhibited control over my physical person, my medical decisions, and my $60 million logistics empire. She also issued permanent maximum distance restraining orders against Preston, Diane, Monica, and Derek, barring them from stepping within 1,000 feet of my properties. I sat at the table, breathing in the sweet, intoxicating air of absolute vindication. But Preston's defense attorney desperately stood up, attempting a final Hail Mary legal maneuver. He argued that because the irrevocable trust was signed under extreme criminal duress and fraudulent pretenses, the entire portfolio should be completely nullified. He demanded that the toxic chemical plant Apex Industries and the crushing $45 million environmental cleanup mandate be instantly transferred back to my name. Jonathan laughed out loud in the quiet courtroom. He turned to the judge and presented the expedited commercial bridge loan applications Preston had frantically signed 3 days ago. Jonathan explained to the court that Preston did not just passively inherit the toxic trust. Preston actively, aggressively, and willingly claimed direct operational management of the hazardous federal Superfund site in a deliberate attempt to defraud a commercial bank out of $15 million. Jonathan cited the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. The law was utterly merciless. By signing those federal underwriting forms and attempting to leverage the poisoned land for personal financial gain, Preston had pierced the corporate veil with his own greedy hands. The judge meticulously reviewed the loan documents. She looked down at Preston, her expression completely devoid of mercy. She delivered the final, devastating ruling. She stated that while the conservatorship was fraudulent, the defendants had actively and knowingly assumed control of the physical assets to commit federal bank fraud. Therefore, the environmental liability remained strictly on the perpetrators. The $45 million debt owed to the United States government was permanently locked onto Preston, Diane, Monica, and Derek. There was no appeal. There was no escape. Preston violently collapsed against the defense table, sobbing hysterically into his shackled hands. The bailiffs stepped forward aggressively, dragging him out of the courtroom to await criminal sentencing. I walked out of the federal courthouse an entirely free man. The crisp, cold Ohio air felt incredible against my skin. My personal security detail was waiting by the curb with a fleet of 3 black armored utility vehicles. Vincent held the back door of the lead vehicle open for me. We drove back to my sprawling, secluded estate in comfortable, victorious silence. I had successfully excised the parasitic rot from my life, and my fortune was completely secure. But the war was not entirely finished just yet. The armored convoy pulled through the towering iron gates of my property and rolled up the long cobblestone driveway. The front doors of the massive mansion were tightly sealed. My lead security officer attempted to unlock the main entrance, but the interior deadbolts had been engaged. We walked around to the expansive glass windows of the grand living room. Diane was inside. She was pacing erratically across the imported Persian rugs, clutching a half-empty bottle of expensive red wine. She had completely barricaded herself inside the sprawling estate. Her passport was confiscated. Her bank accounts were permanently frozen by the federal treasury, and her stolen jewelry was sitting in an evidence locker. She had absolutely nowhere else to go. She was stubbornly refusing to abandon the last shred of the unearned luxury she had brutally manipulated me to acquire. I stood on the cold stone patio, looking at the woman who had secretly hated me for half a century. I motioned my security team to stand back. I pulled a master skeleton key from my coat pocket and stepped up to the heavy oak door. It was time for final eviction. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The massive entryway of the estate was completely silent. The crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling cast long, fractured shadows across the imported marble floor. Diane was standing at the far end of the grand living room. She was clutching a half-empty bottle of expensive red wine like a lifeline. When she heard the door click shut behind me, she dropped the bottle. It shattered against the polished stone, sending a pool of dark crimson spreading across the white marble. She ran toward me. Her bare feet slapped against the floor. She threw herself entirely at my mercy. She collapsed onto her knees, grabbing the tailored fabric of my trousers. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic terror. She began to sob uncontrollably, burying her face into my legs. It was a spectacular theatrical performance of absolute grief. She wailed my name over and over again, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. She looked up at me, her hands trembling violently as she attempted to weave her final desperate web of lies. She told me she was so sorry. She claimed she had absolutely no idea what Preston was planning. She swore to me that our son had manipulated her, that he had threatened her, that he had forced her to go along with the fraudulent medical diagnosis. She cried out that she was just a frightened, helpless mother caught in the middle of his greedy, monstrous ambition. She begged me to forgive her, to protect her from the federal agents, to let her stay in the only home she had ever truly loved. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply stood there like a statue carved from solid ice, looking down at the pathetic, groveling woman who had spent half a century secretly plotting my ultimate demise. I let her cry. I let her exhaust every single ounce of her manipulative energy. When her frantic sobbing finally reduced to a series of pathetic, breathless hiccups, I reached into the interior breast pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. I pulled out the neatly folded sheets of paper I had kept with me since the night I escaped the hospital. I dropped the independent genetic laboratory results directly onto the cold marble floor, right next to her trembling hands. The crisp white paper landed gently in the spreading pool of spilled red wine. I told her to stop talking. My voice was eerily quiet, carrying a lethal, authoritative weight that echoed through the massive living room. I told her the performance was officially over. I instructed her to look at the documents resting by her knees. Diane sniffled, wiping her ruined makeup with the back of her hand. She reached out tentatively and picked up the damp papers. Her eyes darted across the bold black letters printed at the bottom of the page. The probability of paternity was 0%. The blood drained completely from her face. Her jaw went slack. The fake tears stopped instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing, like a suffocating fish, completely incapable of forming a single coherent word. I did not raise my voice. I leaned down slightly, staring directly into the dark, deceitful void of her eyes. I told her I knew everything. I told her I knew about Richard Vance. I watched the physical shockwave rip through her fragile body as I spoke the name of my most hated corporate rival. I described the faded surveillance photograph Vincent had given me at the diner. I detailed the secret, passionate dinners she had shared with a miserable thief while I was out breaking my back in the freezing rain to build this magnificent estate. I told her I knew perfectly well that Preston, Monica, and Derek were not my children. They were the biological offspring of a man who died in absolute, pathetic ruin. Diane began to shake uncontrollably. She dropped the papers, pushing herself backward across the floor, desperately trying to put physical distance between us. She whispered my name, her voice barely a breath, pleading with me to understand. She tried to say it was a mistake from a long time ago, a brief moment of weakness she had deeply regretted every single day. I cut her off immediately. I told her she was a coward and a parasite. But I also told her that her decades of infidelity were not the reason she was going to suffer today. I stood up to my full height, towering over her trembling frame. I told her she had always believed she was the smartest person in the room. She believed she had executed the perfect, flawless deception by hiding her children's true bloodline. But her supreme arrogance had just triggered a catastrophic chain reaction she could not possibly stop. I looked at her with pure cold malice and dropped the final devastating bomb. I explained to her that Richard Vance did not just pass down his inferior genetics to her greedy, incompetent children. I told her that when Richard bankrupted his logistics company 30 years ago, he did not just owe money to legitimate commercial banks. He had borrowed massive, exorbitant sums of cash from the exact same ruthless underground criminal syndicates that Preston was currently deeply entangled with. Richard died owing millions in hidden, unforgiven mob debt. I watched Diane's eyes widen in absolute paralyzing terror as the horrific reality of my words finally connected in her brain. I explained the fatal consequence of her actions. By publicly aligning herself with Preston's criminal enterprise, and by leaving a massive paper trail exposing their true genetic lineage to the federal government during the environmental investigation, she had unwittingly resurrected Richard's ancient unpaid debts. The offshore cartel did not care about the $45 million environmental fine. They only cared about bloodlines and outstanding balances. By proving that her children were the direct biological heirs of Richard Vance, she had just painted a massive glowing target directly onto their backs and onto her own. She gasped for air, clutching her chest, as a violent panic attack consumed her entirely. She fully realized she had not just permanently ruined her comfortable financial life. She had effectively signed her very own physical death warrant. The piercing shriek of the perimeter security alarms echoed through the cavernous living room. Diane flinched violently, covering her ears as she stared out the massive bay windows. Through the reinforced glass, we could see 3 matte black sport utility vehicles idling aggressively at the main iron gate. Their dark-tinted windows offered no view of the men sitting inside, but the menacing presence of the convoy was unmistakable. The offshore cartel had arrived. They were here to collect the $15 million my fake son had stolen, and they were starting with the woman who birthed him. Diane crawled across the spilled red wine. She grabbed my ankles, sobbing with a pathetic, frantic energy. She pleaded with me to call the local police, to hire a mercenary security team, to do absolutely anything to save her miserable life. She swore she would leave the state tomorrow and never bother me again. I looked down at her trembling hands clutching my trousers. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small electronic remote. I pressed the primary lockdown button. The heavy steel shutters immediately dropped over the expansive living room windows, sealing the estate in a secure, impenetrable shell. The deafening security sirens abruptly cut off, leaving the room in a thick, suffocating silence. I walked to the digital security console. The high-definition monitors displayed multiple angles of the front gate. The armed men in the black vehicles were stepping out, analyzing the reinforced steel perimeter. I turned to Diane. She was sitting on the floor, shivering uncontrollably. I told her the reinforced gates of this estate could withstand a direct explosive impact. I told her the men outside could not breach the perimeter without heavy industrial equipment. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the coldest truth of her entire life. I told her they were here for her, not for me. I told her I did not owe a single dime to an international criminal syndicate. Diane gasped for air, her chest heaving, as the horrific reality settled completely into her mind. She realized I was not going to protect her. I walked over to the front hall closet and pulled out a small, cheap canvas suitcase. It was the exact same worn luggage bag I had carried with me 40 years ago when I started my logistics company with absolutely nothing. I dropped the cheap suitcase onto the marble floor right next to her. I told her I had packed it for her earlier this afternoon. Inside were 3 basic sets of plain clothing, a plastic toothbrush, and exactly $100 in crumpled cash. It was the precise amount of money I possessed the first day we met half a century ago. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document bearing the official seal of the state of Ohio. I tossed the paper onto her lap. I told her it was a formal, federally approved eviction notice because the judge had completely revoked the fraudulent medical conservatorship. This morning, my full legal rights to the estate were entirely restored. She had absolutely no legal right to remain on my property for another second. I told her she was officially trespassing. Diane stared at the cheap suitcase and the eviction notice. She began to hyperventilate, shaking her head in complete denial. She pointed a trembling finger toward the steel window shutters, reminding me that ruthless cartel assassins were literally standing at the front gate. She screamed that evicting her right now was a direct death sentence. She accused me of being a cold-blooded monster, claiming I was throwing her to the wolves to be brutally murdered in my own driveway. I watched her panic with absolute unwavering detachment. I told her I did not associate with violent criminals, and I certainly did not offer them human sacrifices on my front lawn. I pressed a button on my encrypted radio. The heavy oak doors leading to the rear kitchen swung open. 4 of my private armed security contractors stepped into the living room. They moved with silent military precision. I instructed them to escort my former wife off the premises immediately. 2 of the contractors grabbed Diane by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. She kicked and screamed, thrashing wildly against their iron grips. She begged me to reconsider, promising to do whatever I wanted. The contractors ignored her pathetic cries. They dragged her out of the living room and hauled her down the long hallway toward the rear service exit. I walked slowly behind them, watching her final moments in my home. We reached the heavy steel doors of the back service entrance. The rear exit led directly out to a secluded access road miles away from the main front gate, where the cartel was currently waiting. I had no intention of letting the cartel kill her. Death was entirely too quick and far too merciful for a woman who had spent 50 years robbing me blind. I wanted her to live a very long, very miserable life, acutely aware of every single thing she had lost. My lead security officer pushed the heavy steel doors open. The freezing night air rushed into the warm hallway. Diane stumbled forward onto the damp concrete of the secluded access road. She looked around frantically, expecting to see cartel assassins waiting in the shadows. But the men waiting for her were not affiliated with the cartel. 3 dark, unmarked federal sedans were parked along the tree line. 5 armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped out of the vehicles, holding steel handcuffs. Jonathan had worked his legal magic perfectly. By submitting the audio recordings of her conspiring to falsify my medical records and actively plotting to poison me, the federal prosecutors had secured a high-level immediate arrest warrant for conspiracy to commit murder and severe elder abuse. They simply grabbed her wrists, slammed her against the hood of the dark sedan, and ratcheted the cold steel cuffs tightly around her arms. Diane looked back at me through the pouring rain, her eyes wide with absolute final despair. She finally realized the profound depth of my revenge. I was not throwing her to the cartel. I was throwing her into a federal maximum security prison, locking her in a concrete cage for the rest of her natural life, while the $45 million environmental debt permanently erased any chance of her ever finding peace. I watched the agents shove her into their vehicle. The sedans pulled away into the dark night, leaving the service road completely empty. I walked back inside my warm, quiet mansion and sat down at my mahogany desk. My phone immediately began to vibrate. I glanced down at the screen. I saw frantic voicemails from Monica and Derek. They were crying, begging for a financial bailout. They claimed federal agents were seizing their children's college funds. They used my fake grandchildren as emotional leverage to save their families from destruction. I listened to their miserable weeping with a cold, triumphant smile. Monica and Derek had spent their adult lives treating my hard-earned wealth as their absolute birthright. Now their panicked voices filled my silent office, vibrating with a pathetic desperation. They pleaded with me to pay the $45 million environmental penalty to save them from the federal agents tearing their luxurious lives apart. They weaponized my supposed grandchildren, crying that the government was going to leave the innocent kids completely homeless. I let the voicemails play out until the message inbox was completely and entirely full. I did not return their calls. I wanted them to feel the exact same paralyzing terror I felt when I woke up in that hospital bed, realizing my family was plotting to murder me. 2 days later, my attorney Jonathan received a formal request from their court-appointed public defenders. Monica and Derek had been brought into the federal detention center for questioning regarding their complicity in the bank fraud. They desperately requested a brief monitored meeting with me. Jonathan advised against it, warning me that they would only attempt to emotionally manipulate me. I told him that I needed to go. I needed to look the children of Richard Vance in the eye, one final time before I permanently and finally closed this very dark and painful chapter of my entire life. I arrived at the federal detention center early the next morning. I walked through the heavy metal security scanners, my expensive tailored suit drawing curious glances from the tired families waiting in the bleak lobby. A guard escorted me down a colorless corridor into a secure visitation room. The space was divided entirely by a thick wall of bulletproof plexiglass. A row of black plastic telephone receivers hung on the wall. I sat down on a hard metal stool and waited. A heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed open. Monica and Derek walked into the room. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The arrogant glow of unearned wealth had been completely stripped from their faces. Monica was wearing a cheap, wrinkled gray sweatshirt. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled and unwashed. Derek walked behind her, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around the small room with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. They sat down on the stools across from me. Their hands were shaking so violently they could barely lift the heavy plastic receivers from the wall mounts. I picked up my phone and held it to my ear. I did not say a single word. I simply waited for them to speak. Monica pressed the phone to her face, tears immediately streaming down her pale cheeks. She called me Dad, her voice cracking with a manufactured, desperate affection. She sobbed, explaining that the Treasury Department had seized her private estate, her vehicles, and every single bank account tied to her name. Derek chimed in, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He told me his wife was threatening to leave him, that the bankruptcy courts were liquidating his remaining hidden assets, and that they were both facing imminent criminal indictments for signing the trust documents. They pressed their hands against the thick, bulletproof glass, begging me to show mercy. Monica used the ultimate emotional weapon. She cried that the federal agents had even frozen the children's college savings accounts. She pleaded with me to pay the environmental fine. She reasoned that my logistics empire was worth $60 million, claiming I could easily absorb the penalty and save my grandchildren from growing up in poverty. She swore they had absolutely no idea what Preston and Diane were planning. She promised they would work for me for free for the rest of their lives if I just bailed them out this one last time. I listened to their breathless begging without breaking eye contact. I let them exhaust every single manipulative tactic they possessed. When they finally stopped talking, staring at me with desperate, tearful eyes, I took a slow, deep breath. I told them they were phenomenal actors just like their mother. I told them I had heard the audio recordings from Preston's office. I knew they had eagerly supported the plan to lock me inside a miserable state-run nursing home so they could divide my fortune among themselves. I watched the blood drain completely from their faces as they realized their absolute complicity was no longer a secret. I told them they were cowards who happily stood by while their brother planned my murder. Then I addressed the issue of the children. I kept my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any warmth. I told Monica and Derek that I recognized their young children were entirely innocent in this vicious conspiracy. I did not want the kids to suffer for the catastrophic sins of their parents. I reached into my jacket pocket and pressed a small, folded legal document against the bulletproof glass. It was a certified financial statement. I explained that 3 days ago, I had instructed Jonathan to set up highly secure, anonymous, and completely untouchable educational trust funds for every single one of my supposed grandchildren. The trusts were heavily guarded by an independent fiduciary firm. The money was strictly designated for their university tuition, housing, and basic medical needs. The federal government could not touch those specific funds, and more importantly, Monica and Derek could never access a single dime of that money to pay off their own debts. I assured them the innocent children were completely safe. They would go to college. They would have a secure future. I watched a brief wave of profound relief wash over Monica's face, but that relief was instantly shattered by my next sentence. I leaned closer to the glass, gripping the plastic phone receiver tightly. I told them the grandchildren were protected, but Monica and Derek were going to get absolutely zero. I told them I was not going to pay the environmental fine. I was not going to hire them defense attorneys. I was not going to give them a single penny of the fortune I had spent 4 decades building. They were going to face the full, merciless weight of the federal government entirely on their own. They were going to lose their luxury homes, their expensive cars, and their unearned social status. They were going to learn what it actually felt like to work for a living. Derek began to hyperventilate, slamming his fist against the plexiglass. He screamed that I was completely ruining their lives over a simple mistake. Monica wailed, begging me not to abandon them to the criminal justice system. I stood up from the metal stool, smoothing out the lapels of my tailored suit jacket. I looked them dead in the eye, delivering the final devastating truth they needed to hear. You chose to dig a grave for a man who worked 40 years to feed you. Now lie in it. I placed the phone receiver back onto the wall hook. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the heavy metal exit doors. Even through the thick glass, I could hear them violently screaming my name, their desperate cries echoing endlessly into the void of their ruined lives. 6 months passed since the day I walked out of that bleak county detention center, leaving behind the shattered remnants of a family that never truly existed. The passage of time brought a profound, absolute silence to my life, a silence that initially felt incredibly heavy, but slowly transformed into the most beautiful peace I had ever known. The federal justice system moved with an unrelenting, merciless efficiency that completely dismantled the arrogant lives of the people who had tried to murder me. Preston was convicted on multiple federal charges, including felony bank fraud, severe elder abuse, and conspiracy. The presiding judge did not show him a single ounce of leniency during the highly publicized sentencing hearing. Preston was handed a mandatory 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There is absolutely no possibility of early parole in the federal system. He spends his days confined to a tiny concrete cell, completely stripped of his tailored Italian suits and his stolen luxury watches. He is currently surrounded by incredibly dangerous men, learning what it actually means to survive at the very bottom of the food chain, without my money to protect his pathetic, very cowardly existence. Diane faced a similarly devastating fate. She managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by pleading guilty to conspiracy, but the federal judge ensured she would not escape her horrific punishment. Because she legally signed the irrevocable trust acceptance forms, the Environmental Protection Agency held her completely and personally liable for the $45 million toxic cleanup mandate. The United States Treasury Department aggressively liquidated her entire life. They seized the massive suburban estate, auctioned off her luxury vehicles, and drained every single hidden offshore bank account she possessed. She was left entirely destitute, carrying a massive federal debt. With absolutely no money and zero remaining assets, Diane was forcibly relocated into a low-income state-funded housing facility located on the dismal outskirts of Cleveland. It is an incredibly bleak, decaying concrete building that smells strongly of cheap bleach and boiled vegetables. It is the exact same type of miserable, forgotten facility she had meticulously chosen to lock me inside when she faked my dementia diagnosis. She spends her final years isolated in a tiny room, eating terrible food, haunted entirely by the horrifying knowledge that her own supreme greed completely destroyed her once comfortable, luxurious life. Monica and Derek suffered the exact same financial annihilation. The environmental mandate completely wiped out their suburban mansions and their lavish lifestyles. They were forced to declare total bankruptcy and find minimum wage employment just to keep a simple roof over their heads. They live in cramped, unremarkable apartments, constantly fighting with each other over their shared misery. True to my word, I ensured the anonymous educational trusts for their young children remained completely untouched and fiercely protected by an independent legal fiduciary. The innocent children will always be safe, but their treacherous parents will suffer for eternity. As for me, my life took a completely different direction. 2 months after the criminal trials concluded, I officially stepped down from my role at Gallagher Freight and Logistics. I sold my entire $60 million corporate empire to a highly respected, deeply honest competitor who promised to maintain my workforce and honor my legacy. The massive transaction was handled perfectly by Jonathan, ensuring my fortune was securely converted into diversified, untraceable private holdings. I was officially retired, completely free from the relentless stress of the shipping industry and entirely liberated from the parasitic leeches who drained my energy. I am 78 years old now, and I have never felt more incredibly alive. I purchased a beautiful custom-built luxury yacht and relocated permanently to the warm, crystal-clear waters of the Florida Keys. I spend my mornings sitting on the polished wooden deck, feeling the gentle ocean breeze against my weathered skin, and watching the golden sun rise over the endless horizon. The suffocating winter cold of Ohio is nothing more than a distant, faded memory. My new life is now wonderfully simple, deliberately quiet, and completely devoid of any malicious manipulation or hidden toxic agendas. I am not alone in this tropical paradise. I chose to surround myself strictly with a very small, tightly knit circle of people who have proven their absolute loyalty beyond any shadow of a doubt. Vincent, the retired federal investigator who helped me uncover the devastating truth about my fake children, purchased a small, beautiful beachfront property just a few miles down the coast. We often spend our long afternoons deep-sea fishing, sharing quiet stories about our past lives over cold beers. I is a steadfast, honest companion who values truth and integrity above absolutely all other things. Jonathan visits me several times a year, flying down from the freezing Midwest to escape the corporate grind. We sit on the deck of my yacht, sipping glasses of premium-aged bourbon, and laugh about the brilliant, flawless legal trap we successfully orchestrated together. They are not my blood relatives, but they have proven themselves to be infinitely more reliable, honest, and honorable than the treacherous family I was cursed with for 50 years. We share a profound mutual respect forged in the blazing fires of adversity and total betrayal. They are my true family in every single sense. Sometimes, as the orange sun slowly dips below the dark blue ocean waves, I think back to that freezing afternoon in my home office when I signed the $7 million trust. I think about the chilling, victorious smile on Diane's face and the unbelievable cruelty in Preston's voice. That specific moment completely broke my heart into a million pieces, but it also forcefully removed the heavy blindfold from my eyes. The pain of their absolute betrayal was incredibly agonizing, but it was also the powerful catalyst that ultimately saved my life and secured my total unconditional freedom forever. I no longer carry the heavy burden of providing for ungrateful thieves. I am the sole master of my own destiny, sailing peacefully across the beautiful open sea. My fortune remains completely secure. My mind is exceptionally sharp, and my remaining days belong entirely to me. I finally won the ultimate glorious war against my very own terrible fake family. Blood does not automatically make someone your family, and unconditional love should never mean unconditional foolishness. When you spend your entire life building an empire to protect the people you care about, you must make sure they are not silently sharpening a knife behind your back. Greed is a highly toxic poison that completely blinds people to gratitude. I learned the hardest way possible that you must always verify the absolute loyalty of those standing closest to you. True power is having the courage to walk away and ruthlessly protect your peace when the people you trusted most fail you. If my story struck a chord with you today, remember to always trust your gut and protect your hard-earned legacy. Do not let anyone take advantage of your kindness. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more raw stories,